Hello, I'm Dr. Christina Gunther. I'm an anti-oppression educator and a member of the Coastal Connecticut chapter of Results. I welcome you to another micro-learning moment. Today's topic is structural racism. Today, we're going to discuss the critical connection between structural racism and poverty. Structural racism refers to the systems, policies, and practices that create and perpetuate racial inequalities across institutions, such as education, housing, employment, healthcare, and criminal justice. These inequalities are deeply embedded in our society. They stem from times of slavery and when the idea of race was created in order to justify the practice of enslaving human beings. The legacies of slavery significantly contribute to the disproportionate rates of poverty experienced by communities of color today. So understanding this link is crucial to our work in ending poverty and promoting social justice. To grasp the roots of this issue, we must look at the legacy of slavery and segregation in our country. Even after emancipation, discriminatory policies and practices such as Jim Crow laws, redlining, the GI Bill, and housing discrimination systematically excluded people of color from access to quality education, jobs, and homeownership. The effects of these historical injustices are still very evident in the striking intergenerational wealth disparities that we see currently. The wealth gap between African American and white families in the US is significant and it's persistent. According to the 2019 survey of consumer finances conducted by the Federal Reserve, the median wealth of white families was $188,200, while the median wealth of African American families was only $24,100. Basically, that means the typical white family has nearly 8 times the wealth of a typical African American family. Structural racism is also evident in the disparities we see in education and employment. Communities of color often face unequal access to quality education because of underfunded schools, fewer experienced teachers, and limited resources. A significant portion of public school funding comes from local sources, primarily property taxes, which often perpetuates inequalities between wealthy and poor districts. This gap leads to disparities in academic achievement, college readiness, and career prospects. Even when people of color obtain degrees, they face discrimination in hiring and promotions, often being passed over for less qualified white candidates. These wage gaps and occupational segregation further limit economic mobility, with people of color overrepresented in low-wage jobs and underrepresented in higher-paying fields. So these barriers make it incredibly difficult for individuals and families to break out of poverty. The criminal justice system is another area where structural racism has really devastating impact. Communities of color are subjected to over-policing and racial profiling, leading to disproportionate rates of arrests, convictions, and incarceration. The war on drugs and tough on crime policies have fueled the mass incarceration. A criminal record creates significant barriers to employment, housing, education, public assistance, further perpetuating these cycles of poverty and marginalization. The impact on families is severe, with children growing up without parents and struggling to break free from the grip of poverty. This can have lifelong devastating effects. Structural racism also contributes to health disparities. Many communities of color face unequal access to healthcare. There are fewer hospitals, clinics, or medical professionals in their neighborhoods. The lack of access combined with higher rates of insurance and underinsurance leads to delayed or completely foregone care, and therefore worse health outcomes. Environmental racism also plays a role, with communities of color disproportionately exposed to pollutants, toxins, and other environmental hazards that contribute to chronic diseases and shorter life expectancies. The chronic stress of dealing with racism and discrimination also takes a toll on mental and physical health, compounding the challenges of poverty and limiting opportunities for well-being and success. So, as grassroots political advocates working to end poverty, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and actively address structural racism in our work. And this means advocating for policies that promote racial equity across all systems and institutions. We need to push for fair housing policies, equitable school funding, criminal justice reform, and healthcare access in communities of color. And by working in solidarity with communities of color and taking a holistic, very intersectional approach, we can build a movement for economic and racial justice that leaves no one behind. So your to-do list is here, along with these key takeaways. And I thank you for taking the time to learn more about structural racism today. Please join me next time for another micro learning moment.